David. I'm one of the co-presidents of ASIS, Simmons ASIS that's putting on this event. And disclosure, I interned at Northeastern University for a short while, and that's where I met Amanda, and sort of learned about design for diversity. And so I wanted to share it more with the wider Simmons community.
Do you want us just to jump?
Yeah, I mean, I think that now is a good enough time. I think if you can start by introducing yourselves.
And actually, because we're a nice small group, you have to tell me if I have cupcake on my face.
Okay.
Because we're a nice small group, it would actually be great, for me at least, if we could all sort of go around and introduce ourselves and let me know what sorts of things you're interested in. Because there's a formal presentation that we've done before, but we don't try to be formal. So I
actually wanted this to be in a room that was like a circular classroom, but unfortunately we couldn't get it. But we'll try and recreate that atmosphere.
So my name is Amanda. I am the assistant director of the Digital Scholarship Group, which is over in the Northeastern University Libraries. I'm a digital humanities librarian and English librarian. So my work is sort of project management and kind of I'm the person that's sort of between the user and the programmer in terms of the infrastructure stuff that we do. I work with students and faculty and staff. And I am a Simmons grad. I graduated from Simmons in 2004, so it is very different now. I think it was even different then. So my knowledge of Simmons is outdated.
My name is Mattie Clear. I think my official title is a research associate on the Design for Diversity team at Northeastern. I am also a student in my first year here at Simmons. I'm in the dual Archives and History program. Outside of that, what I bring to the table is my museum context. So I've worked at the Library of Congress. I interned there for a summer. I've worked in a few small museums. I have a background in public history and museums, and so that's kind of where I come at the project. But, yeah. Oh, I also work at MIT, so the other thing.
Yeah. So then, I'll just point and potentially embarrass someone. Can we go?
I'm Melissa, also a first year student here in the dual archive. Wait, I always say that wrong. Dual program, archive management and history. My goal is to work with genealogy in the long run. Yeah. So I basically start practicing with my own family, and I've tried to create a path to get to that end goal. So far, I got lucky with finding Simmons.
That's awesome.
What did you want to know?
Just who you are and what you're interested in, and that way if we think of anything, your social and your mother's maiden name.
Okay. Well, my grandmother. My name is Natalie, and I'm also in my first year of the dual program that everyone else, you guys keep talking about. And there's like 8 of them. I shouldn't say it like that, but I'm really interested in art museums. So I'm just here because it seems interesting. So.
Yeah, I'll just say David again. My interests especially lie in cataloging and metadata work.
I'm Molly Carlson. I am the other co-chair for ASIS and actually come from more of a techier background. My undergrad was in South Carolina. I majored in computer information systems, which is like a cross between business and programming. So that was really cool in your major. I have experience in like a variety of different like tech-based fields. Like I worked in the archive. I took time off for work. Mobile development, and my dream job at this point to work for a firm called Medtronic that I've been for in the past, which manufactures medical technology.
Hi, probably good, but I'm Michael. I'm also a first year in the program. And my interests are kind of in systems, and like systems librarianship, because that's what I was doing before I entered Simmons, and I also bring kind of an interest in history and archives as well, having done history in undergrad as well. So yeah, I'm looking forward to just kind of the intersection of those two, like history and tech and systems. So yeah.
Awesome, thank you. I won't put anyone else on the spot. You think you're busy. Okay, so a little bit about this. This is sort of a, like I said, this is sort of a formal or version of a formal presentation that we've done before. But I'm happy to kind of skip around and really take a lot of questions and sort of make it more talky, especially because it's a nice small group. And you're going to hear me, so the structure of this is with Mattie jumping in and particularly telling me what I've gotten wrong with some of the lit review. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the background of this project, and we tried to do a really robust survey of prior work. And so for part of that, I want to share some of the group's sort of favorite articles from that prior work, some stuff that you might be familiar with, hopefully stuff that you're not also, so there'll be like interesting reading to think about. And then we'll actually look at the toolkit, which was sort of one of our big outcomes, this teaching and learning toolkit around what we're calling inclusive information systems. Although if you come up with a better phrase that is very transparent to people that are not in information science, let us know. So we can take a look at that actual toolkit. And then we also have the option for some discussion around how this does or does not or could show up in LAS Archives Education. So that's sort of big three chunks. That's how we've done this. So, without any further ado, did we introduce ourselves? Yes. So, I always like to point out that this is a big grant team. And so this is based on an IMLS National Forums grant. Folks are, I think, familiar with the IMLS, Institute for Museum and Library Services. They're kind of like the NEH for libraries in terms of grant funding in particular. So it's a federal grant, and the National Forums program is really to sort of convene thinkers and stakeholders around an urgent issue and kind of do reporting and learn about that issue, and then put what you've learned into a very easily shareable form. So we decided part of our form would be this teaching and learning toolkit, in addition to a white paper. So folks are familiar with the term white paper, right? Generally, it's sort of an informal report that you write at the end of something, not really, I'm sure there's an even better definition. So this is the grant team. It's evolved a little bit over time. And I think it's also important to note that we are not community archives experts. I think of the team, probably Nancy and Des have the most actual hands-on archives processing experience, with Mattie coming up quickly behind, or will be. And so our team, the Digital Scholarship Group at Northeastern, is a technical team, for lack of a better phrase. So I hate to kind of reify that sort of public services, technical services split you get in libraries, but I'm going to use it a little bit just as a useful sort of, rubric. So our Digital Scholarship Group builds infrastructure for projects, right? So not me, but our digital repository manager is in the department. And we also have a system for creating digital exhibits and websites that we build and maintain. So we are kind of the group, I think of us as the group to whom the community archivists come, right? So our archivist goes out, does amazing work. The focus of our archives is underrepresented groups in Boston's history. So it started with, it's expanded some, but the original focus was the LGBTQ community, Asian American, African American, and Latina communities in Boston, and that's been the focus of our archives for about 20 years. So it's not a new focus. So part of our thinking was people go out, establish really good relationships with groups who actually have a lot of reason to mistrust cultural heritage institutions, and then they bring that stuff to us, And how do we not drop the ball on the technical end, right? On the database end, on the metadata end. If someone has done that work of doing good allyship even, right? How do we not then screw that up once we get to the system? It's one way that we think about that. And what I also want to highlight here is that we're not claiming to be community archives experts, right? In the archival literature, there are a ton of people thinking about this, right? Like Documenting the Now, Burgess Jules writes a lot about this in really amazing ways. So we are not those people. Lots of other people that are involved in a grant. I always just like to show this because when you get a grant, it makes a lot of work for a lot of other people. So that is like sort of the take-home message for that. Okay, so what is design for diversity? This is our pitch. Focuses on the ways in which information systems embody and reinforce cultural norms, and asks how we might design systems that account for diverse cultural, you can read, but cultural materials and ways of knowing. So as part of this project, we formed an advisory board. We did a really robust review of work that was out there and held 2 public events where we sort of said, come tell us about case studies where you have encountered problems with information systems in cultural heritage. So I should also be specific that our focus is cultural heritage, right? Libraries, archives, museums. And we sort of pulled all this together, and we're currently working on wrapping up the white paper. But the other major outcome was this toolkit. So we sort of said to ourselves, our audience is, I think Mattie mentioned, is it the Museum of Cowboy? What is it called?
Western Heritage Museum.
Western Heritage Museum, which people informally sometimes call
Yeah, it's the
Cowboy
National
Museum.
Cowboy Museum.
National Cowboy Museum. So this is in Oklahoma, is that right?
Yes.
In Oklahoma. So we are picturing as one of our potential people who is thinking about this as someone who is at a relatively small museum. Maybe they are the only processing archivist, or the only technical services archivist, or the only systems administrator. And that museum says, we want to put our stuff online, right? And this, like, put our stuff online can mean a whole bunch of different things, as you all know, right? Digitization, metadata, access points, user interface, right? So everyone here knows that. So that person saying to themselves, I want to be sensitive to the fact that we have, as you pointed out, a lot of Native American artifacts that were possibly cataloged in the 1980s, right? How do I move those online in a responsible way, if they even should be moved online? So picturing that person as one of our potential major users, we decided that in addition to a white paper, we wanted to produce things like short case studies or study paths where someone could sort of do a learning activity and kind of a pre-selected collection of readings that would be short and to the point and impactful, and something that either someone could use to educate themselves or something that they could take to their boss and say, look, this is important because other people in cultural heritage say it's important. So that's where this idea of a toolkit comes from. So that's an overview of the project. So this is where I feel like this is some of the most fun that I have, because this is where we're just going to tell you about awesome work other people have done, right? Because it's always a mistake to assume that you are the first to do something, right? And so the way that I like to frame this is to really think about concrete examples. So first, this is our Zotero library. Yeah, Mattie is intimately familiar with this Zotero library. She's been helping us sort of go through it. I think there are over 400 items in this library by now, but it's a lot of different projects and readings, all thinking about diversity, inclusion, and technical services. We also, I should have mentioned too, with this, tried to make sure we were interdisciplinary, right? People are talking about this in digital humanities, they're talking about this in sociology, they're talking about it in history, of course, library archives, etc. And so I'm going to pull out some of what our group over time has come to think are the most foundational things, but I did want to say there were a couple of really interesting trends that we saw. And so one is based on an earlier poster that we did, which I thought was kind of darkly humorous. You might expect it. Even within the library literature, the archives literature, and the museum literature, people were not reading and citing each other. Even like, you know, American Archivist versus the ASIS Journal, right? The people reading ASIS Journal were not reading American Archivist, and vice versa. we may like to pretend that they are, and we're all special snowflakes. Public libraries and academic libraries are not in the same conversations about these things. And there are a lot of fields like post-colonial studies, again, digital humanities, English departments that are writing a lot about the archive, a lot of theorizing about the archive that's happening without any concrete understanding of how archives actually operate. So those were some of the big themes. The other final theme that I thought was really interesting is that a lot of these articles, particularly in technical fields, right, so particularly in computer science, information science, were written by women, not men. And particularly there's a lot of women of color who are doing amazing work in this area. And it's just sort of interesting to note, even in fields like computer science that are majority men, it was anecdotally mostly women that were writing about these issues. And in library archives museums, you might expect that a little bit, right? Because it is a majority female profession. But it's just sort of something to note. And I don't have data, but that's my impression from reviewing like quite a lot of this work. Any other themes, Mattie, that you would add, looking at the sort of overall theme before I start picking out? You don't have to, I'm putting you on the spot, yeah, I didn't prepare.
No, you're right in that they don't like to talk to each other in the different disciplines.
Yeah.
And they are mostly individuals in the communities that they're talking about. It's very rarely like other individuals taking an interest in those communities.
So this is one of our favorite writers that's come through, Doris Hargret Clack. She, Dr. Clack, she writes in 1973, she did an initial study on the adequacy of Library of Congress subject headings for researchers in African American studies and history. So she's doing this in 1973. And I think it's important to note her work as well. Folks are probably familiar with the Sanford Berman Antipathies and Prejudices tract, possibly. It's like it came out in, I think, 71. And it was one of the earliest sort of large publications really analyzing the shortcomings of Library of Congress subject headings in terms of diversity, inclusion. Her work is right around the same time, and she kind of carries it through for decades. But I feel like her name is not as represented in the library science literature as it should be. So she's important for that reason. Also because she's writing in, again, early 1973, and then in 1979 she expands that work with a co-author in an article called Treatment of People and Peoples in Subject Analysis. So again, 1979, this is not a new topic, people are thinking about this. And so they find in 1979, for example, that Mexican Americans can only be described in LCSH at that time as Mexicans -- in the United States. There was no actual subheading for Mexican American. You were never going to be Mexican American. It was always going to be no Mexican in the United States. That has been changed. Although some of these I'm like, I don't even want to look and see if they've been changed. They also mentioned in 1979, for example, the sanitization of history. The subject heading at the time for the Japanese internment camps actually used the phrase evacuation and relocation. Right? This is not what an internment camp is. It's not an evacuation and relocation as if that's for someone's good. The other interesting thing about Clack's work is that she follows it up in 1995, looking at online catalogs. So she really has this view of having started in 73 all the way through 95. And that article is called Subject Access to African American Studies, Resources in Online Catalogs. And so she revisits her work and uses that one. So I'd like to point out her work, not to sort of have a moment of, look how ignorant people were in 1979, but more to have a moment of, this has been a problem in our profession for a very long time, and it's been something that we have recognized in the pre-digital age as well, right? So I think it's getting a lot more attention now, but there's no reason it couldn't have gotten a lot more attention earlier. And I also think it's important to point out, a lot of times this session can become the Library of Congress subject heading complaint hour. And that is a legitimate complaint hour to have, but there's sort of a lot of other aspects to this. So next, what I want to share is, this is our model of the technical stack, right? So if you Google computer stack, technical stack, you'll see different models. This is ours that we kind of pulled together for our own purposes, and then through some others. But basically it's a way of unpacking, if there is a digital collection in front of you, what are all the layers of technology that have happened before that, or that are going on behind that. And I also like to point this out because LCSH is just one layer here, right? LCSH is just the data structure and the data model. We are all generally very comfortable in that layer. That is a lot of what our profession looks at. When we think museum registration cards, right, that is a data structure, even if it's a physical registration card. When we think a finding aid, right, that is a form of a data structure. So a lot of the literature in the cultural heritage world is in that layer, and that's fine, right? That might be where we have the most impact. But issues of diversity and inclusion can sort of operate at all levels. So before I go on, so then I'm going to share some more of our favorite readings. Before I go on, does anyone have any questions? Do people want to talk more about any of these layers? Like, what does this layer mean, or where have you seen this particular tech layer operate? Questions about how exactly we mean these terms? They could be interpreted in multiple ways. If it looks clear, that's fine. Is that a question? Yeah.
I mean, I was just going to comment, you don't normally see hardware and chip design kind of making their way into these stacks.
Mm-hmm.
Normally it stops at like the actual like cables.
Right. Yeah, and you can kind of quite constructively sort of disagree with our layering in this. Like sometimes you'll see network right above hardware and chip design. But I think the hardware and chip design becomes particularly important when we're talking about, as I'm sure folks in this room know, global impact, or materials from underrepresented groups where the actual hardware to view that material may or may not be the same hardware that you're using to build it, right? Like one really interesting example, we had a case study from folks who were building a digital library of some of the artifacts that had been destroyed in some of the recent wars in Iraq and Iran. And the question is kind of, who is that website for if that whole city has been destroyed? Right? Where are the people that lived next to that artwork, and what are they doing right now? And do they really need a website from you? Like, is a website, and you know, on the one hand you have to kind of say, that's our job, that's what we do, so we're going to do what we can. But in terms of sort of thinking about priorities for your work, that's where I think the hardware and chip design can come. Okay, any other questions, comments about this? Does anyone have any favorite readings that they can think of before I go into this, like favorite projects, discussions?
What the recent most read Cynthia Noble, what was it, Algorithms of Oppression?
Yes.
In terms of the third one, I guess, talking about how Google is biased in many ways, and I'm sure we're all aware of that as librarians, but especially towards women and people of color and women of color.
Yeah. And there are two, and we are, that is, you are like a plant in the audience.
I wasn't aware.
Yeah. Sophia Noble and LaTanya Sweeney are two black women who are doing a lot of really interesting work in that area. And so that's sort of our two main theorists when we think about the algorithmic bias is the phrase that you're thinking about there. And folks may have, did you ever see in the news, ProPublica did an article about there's a system called COMPAS, C-O-M-P-A-S, where criminal justice systems are using an algorithm to assign risk points to people to try to calculate the risk of their reoffending. And then judges are using that in determining sentences. And I see everyone going, right? Like you can already see potential issues with this. And so ProPublica did an expose that found, let me think for a second to make sure I got this right, because it's not one of the examples, so I don't have the pattern down for it. Even with all other things being the same, right, so like age, socioeconomic status, educational attainment, okay, so all those variables being the same, the algorithm over-predicted when Black people would reoffend, even if it didn't turn out to be true in actuality, and under-predicted when white people would reoffend. Yeah.
What were their data points? Were they other people who had like gone out of jail?
I don't know. Yeah.
Because also like you have to take into account the systems in which people are released. Sorry.
No, right, so, but I mean, you're already on the right path, right? So, and also, what are the systems of sentencing? Like sentencing is very unfair.
Right.
So then if you take someone's prior sentence as a data point, are you taking into account the bias that led to that sentence being higher in some cases than not? I Google it, I cannot represent it well.
What was the name of the writer again?
So the company, it's ProPublica, P-R-O-Publica, and the system is Compass System, C-O-M-P-A-S. And the Compass system generally has gotten a lot of attention if you just look for Compass and algorithmic bias. As far as I've seen, algorithmic bias is sort of the phrase that is most Googleable. Okay, so I'm going to go through these a little bit quickly, or try to, so we can get to the toolkit itself. So in user interface, what I would just point out is this thread, there are many different threads, but a thread around feminist HCI. So folks are familiar with HCI as a discipline, human-computer interaction. So it is a subdiscipline within computer science. And Xiaowen Barzell in particular wrote this initial article on feminist HCI. And so there's a lot of work in HCI on usability and industrial, it's kind of an algorithm of industrial design even. And so how people use objects in a sort of studied in an anthropological way is sort of how I would describe that. That's probably a terrible description. And so Barzell talks about thinking of a constellation of qualities where you could do feminist interaction design. So think about, like, let's imagine what the design process is at Apple Computers. What if the design process really focuses on pluralism, participation, embodied identities, right? Which is something that really comes from feminist theory, which is very much like, how are our bodies different? And how does that affect the state of what we're able to use or not use? So I would point people towards, and then Chris Borg and Beth Sadler in Code for Live have a pretty well-known article. If folks haven't read that article, that's a great one to do. And they were a lot focusing on the user interface piece. I don't know, there's a lot here. We'll send you the links. But this is sort of where I would return to libraries and archives are very comfortable at this layer because we're thinking about like any information system is a data. It involves an inherent data model. And in particular, the Brian Deere scheme is experiencing a lot of really interesting work in Canada. So Brian Deere was a First Nations librarian in Canada, and I think in either the 70s or the 80s, he developed an alternative classification system that worked much better for First Nations and Indigenous materials in Canada, that worked better than Library of Congress subjectivities. And so recently, there's been sort of several libraries in Canada revisiting that. And are folks familiar with Cataloging and Classification Quarterly? You have seen it, right? Like the major cataloging journal. They had a recent special issue on Indigenous knowledge systems, so that's great to check out, or hand to a professor. Sorry. Either way. And I'm just talking a lot, but if there's any of your favorite articles that you also want to shout out, you know. Emily Drabinsky and Amber Billy have also done a lot of really wonderful stuff with LGBTQ issues and gender representation in catalogs. So definitely check out
The LGBT terminology in library. Sorry to go back to LCSH
it's
again,
true,
but
yeah.
it's actually like currently under debate, and like there's like another proposal that just came up about changing things, and I think it's really interesting. And in querying the catalog, she talks a lot about
Yeah.
like whether we should strive for you know, changing everything, or sort of acknowledging whether the catalog itself is a text that has its own
Right, like should you just
bias.
understand it as a messy, always on the edge of broken system?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're not describing reality that exists.
Or,
And also, I mean, you have these same terms that are outdated in the context of describing all minorities or people who are marginalized. So it goes from being outdated, just racist and harmful for so many people. So there was someone, I think an undergrad at Dartmouth, who started a campaign to replace the word illegal alien, the subheading illegal alien with non-citizen. So it actually worked within the Library of Congress. They were very enthusiastic about it. They made an announcement that we were replacing this term, but then Congress actually shot that replacement down with a bill that was like stopping partisan policy in the Library of Congress. And it was just like, you can't see like the harm this is doing. They cited it as a needless policy change and just said, oh yeah, it's bad for taxpayers because it's gonna cost money. There was no acknowledgement of, we understand this term may cause some problems, it's just we wanted to keep this term just because. And so it's also important to like hold up Congress accountable like to an extent, but then like it's a federal institution like in a network of federal institutions too, which also has say over what can happen. And that's something people forget because it's still a library where you don't think there will be like that much of a backlash or stuff like that.
Actually, just like to dig into that like for another second. What I found interesting about that was in one of my classes, they made us actually watch the congressional hearing where they were talking about that.
no.
And so that was kind of painful. But like what they were arguing was that like the language should be kept because that's the language that's used in the laws. And so one of the issues is that LCSH, like many other systems, is like based on a system of like literary warrant, that like whatever term is largely used in published literature or whatever, like is the term that needs to be used. And that can often come into conflict with what is, explicitly harmful. So that's like a real issue that needs to be dealt with at some point.
Right, and I think and so this is why I feel like while LCSH is important to talk about, it's almost its sort of position that's more important than a lot of other things. So I think the point that it is the Library of Congress is a really important one, right? Because we don't have a national library in the U.S., as people know. We have this library that's like this weird appendage of Congress that's kind of a national. So I don't know anyone there. Okay, you work there. You know more people there than I do. But I don't think they have the freedom to act that sometimes we assume that they do. Not to say that there are a lot of cataloging procedures that could be streamlined and updated, right? I'm not saying that they can't, but
There are a lot more red tape than I think people realize as far as
right.
what is able to happen and what can and can't happen. And then I think a lot of times people just assume that they're not short-staffed, when in actuality they're extraordinarily short-staffed, and people are retiring and they're not replacing them. So it's a sad time everywhere.
Welcome to the bummer hour. But I think it's because I've been there myself. It's really easy to feel adversarial towards the groups that maintain LCSH, and I think we get more done if you are not as adversarial. And I think think also what you mentioned, David, that we're talking about the difference between a prescriptive or a descriptive vocabulary in some ways, right? That Library of Congress, again, literary warrant, it's supposed to describe what exists rather than prescribe actually. And when you say descriptive and prescriptive, it's sort of like for which group, right? For this particular group, to describe themselves, they might want to say, and I want to prescribe, and I have the right to prescribe that other people sort of use this terminology. Yeah. All right, so software applications, I just do, we talked a little bit about this before, but I just do want to point out, well, all of these people, they're all amazing. Cynthia Noble's original work, and she has an article in Bitch magazine, actually, that I think in some ways is a more powerful read than some of her more academic articles. She's an amazing writer. I shouldn't say that like I'm disparaging her work, but more, I think when you write for a magazine, you have the freedom to kind of be evocative in a way that you don't always in academic writing. And she writes sort of really beautifully, but powerfully about when she started her research. She was sort of imagining young black girls who would go to Google and type in the phrase black girls, and maybe looking for like what books are black girls reading, or where can I talk to other young black girls on the internet, or what's popular, etc. And at that time, which I think is like 7 or 8 years ago now, the top results in Google for that search phrase were pornographic. Right? It was porn. And so she was sort of saying, like, imagine the harm to a young person. It's like, I want to, again, like, talk to other people who are my age, or find out what are some fun books to read, or whatever, and you get, like, oh no, here's what Google thinks of you. Even though no one, who's thinking. That has changed, and I think there's been a lot of sort of work around that, and her book, Algorithms of Oppression, sort of came out of that initial strain of work, and a lot more work. And Sweeney's work, I want to say she's a lawyer by training, but she looked at Google search results and how, so you have the Google search results, and you get, if you search for a person's name, you get the little thing at the side that says like, find out all their private information, give us money, or search for arrest records, right? And if you've ever seen that in your Google search results. So she found that if you search for a stereotypically black name, you would get the advertisements for arrest records, even if there was no arrest record for that person, right? So she, a couple of times, would go all the way through and be like, okay, do you actually have any arrest records for this person? The answer is no. But it was still coming up because there was something, like, who knows, garbage in, garbage out, right? Like bad data or bad algorithmic design, who knows? But there was something in the Google algorithm that was saying if you get a stereotypically black name, you should see an offer to search arrest records, even if there was no actual record behind that. So those are some of the examples. Again, algorithmic bias is the term that I would use for that. So those are the 3 sort of stacks, or the 3 layers in the stack that we, I think in our professions are most familiar with. For example, with software applications, you can sort of start to ask questions like, how does the library discovery system work? What is that algorithm actually doing? What is it weighting? What kind of decisions is it making? So those things we can start to query. We can go further down, but I don't want to talk too much more at this point. So some of the themes that we came out of this was, so I spent all that time with the stack model, right? So then at the midpoint of this project, we were like, throw it out, right? The stack model isn't important. What's important is the design process that you use whenever you're in an individual project. So knowing that you're trying to create inclusive metadata for an archival collection, and knowing that you're at the data structure level is helpful, but the important thing is that you actually have the right process for creating that metadata, right? So it's really, and this is where, I sort of say this is where like civil rights activists from the 1960s are like, duh, right? It's all about process, that's what's important. So some some of the things that we really learned from our partners were, for example, sort of this idea of who is centered and who is unmarked in your system. And so with the unmarked, I think you could think of that as system defaults, basically. And Emily Drubinsky, again, she's so amazing, wrote a case study for us on unmarked language in library catalogs, and her clarifying example that I think she found at the reference desk, right? She was at the reference desk and stuff like that. Is if you want to find information about Black women or items written by Black women, you say Black women, right? But if you want to find items written by white women, there's no phrase for white women. It's just women. So the default woman is kind of a white woman, right? And you can also sort of think of all sorts of system defaults, not just in cataloging, but in, what are the default user permissions, right? What are the, my mind suddenly went totally blank, but think about like system defaults, that's the marked, unmarked, and then in the end, yeah.
It even applies to like very general terms like race, gender. I mean, it's one thing to say things like diversity or inclusion and think of which races come to mind when they have race that should be included more generally. But even just like words like race, which races would you think of? Or gender, like you wouldn't normally think of men, you think of gender, you think of women. Or, transgender, or anyone else who maybe not necessarily qualified in her their self as a gender. So I mean, so even with those general terms, like you're automatically going to like these more marginalized areas.
I think so, and that's where like part of what I think makes this project and this work so interesting is that, at least at this moment in time in computers, you have to have a system. Because a computer needs a system right now, right? At their base, computers are very stupid. They need directions to follow. But how do you create a sort of flexible, networked project and system that accounts? Anyway, yes. But I love that the idea of questioning what your system defaults are, and then that helps you figure out who is centered in the system, who is assumed to be the user, right? So the user of the catalog looking for information about white women just knows that you type in women, not white women. And Emily pointed out, if you type in white women, you get like white supremacy, white nationalist stuff often. So it's sort of like, oh, we only need to use that tag if they're acting outside of the norm, sort of. I mean, who knows, right? You can interpret this in a lot of different ways. And I think the other thing that I'll sort of discuss that we really learned from our partners is the idea of asking more from commercial systems. So we came at this from an angle of, we work a lot with special collections where people are creating their own metadata. We roll our own repository system that's a Fedora, Hydra, Sambera system. We use WordPress a lot. We're building our own. But really like 80–90% of cultural heritage information is in a commercial system, right? It's in like, what's it called, the museum system? Yeah. Which I find hilarious, like that was the name they came up with.
Very original.
TMS, the museum system. Or Past Perfect, right, for archives. So there's maybe a lot more we can do with commercial systems. In the interest of time, I'll just point out that Emergent Strategies by Adrienne Marie Brown is an amazing book about organizing and organizing projects. But the final sort of takeaway message that we've gotten is really looking at these words efficient and optimized. So who has either at work or in class created a workflow or talked about an optimized, an optimal workflow for processing, cataloging? Like when folks process, so actually I should back up. So has anyone processed an archival collection yet? Yeah, right, you're learning how to do that, right. So how were you trained on them? Like, sorry, when you sat down to do it, like who?
You're talking about the work, like the direction.
Yeah, who gave you directions? What kind of instructions did you get?
For me, it was the director of the department I was working under, but they didn't so it wasn't even, yeah. And, should I call them out?
No.
I'm maybe not on the live stream, I guess, yeah.
But they're one of the like well-known top archives in the country, and they were using an IT person to create the databases for the collections.
Yeah.
Which meant there was always problems with them.
What kind of problems?
For one, I guess not having standardized. I guess standardization is good and bad, but like each collection needs certain things cataloged.
Yeah.
But I think because it was an IT person, they weren't thinking of like certain things like, I don't know, like the book size of the item, like small stuff like that that archivists will think of.
Right. And they're actually very important for special
Yeah.
collections, right? Like the size of the thing matters
Right.
in a way that doesn't necessarily, yeah. And I think, I love that example, especially with the IT thing. So I think most folks in this room who are interested in New England ASIS/design/technical design, right? Like you are either already or going to be that IT bridge person, quite possibly. And the idea of efficient and optimized, those words are really loaded in computer science, and those words are really loaded in the library world, and they're really loaded in IT. It means generally the fastest and the cheapest, right? I'm happy to have other meanings from the crowd, but like, if you think of, right, like what's the optimal workflow, what does that mean?
I always think of like trying to like cut corners to get like the most output.
Most output. Yeah, that's a good, right? Maybe not even necessarily fast, but most and fast kind of intertwine. Yeah.
Yeah.
What
There's
else?
the saying that the laziest person finds the best shortcuts.
Or finds the hackiest shortcut.
Hackiest shortcuts.
I mean, that's one way of reading efficient optimized, but the same thing. You could also develop problems that may be unnecessary if you had just done it in a more streamlined way, or in something that took more time. I guess a great way to compare these two things would be with two transfer protocols we see in like networking. So like TCP or Transfer Control Protocol or UDP, User Datagram Protocol. They're both ways of transferring data clients to hosts and servers. And a good way to imagine them is like TCP. It takes a lot more time, but it's like building a bridge where you build a connection and you can make sure the data gets safely transferred. That's like building a bridge. UDP is just like firing a rocket where it's extremely fast, it's extremely efficient, but it's also not efficient because you have less of a guarantee that the data will be safely transferred.
And so in both of those cases, I think you could envision each designer saying, my system is optimal, right? But it's optimal for X.
Right, it depends on the data that's being transferred. Like
The data and your goal, right? Is my goal fastest? Is my goal most secure? Is my goal whatever? But a lot of times, and I'll say this, like particularly when I'm talking to our programmers, when I'm talking to our like associate deans in charge of this, like we throw around the word efficient, optimal, like it's sort of transparent, but it's really not. And so what we came to was rather than defining efficient and optimal in terms of technological goals, we should define it in terms of personal goals, right? So, or interpersonal goals. So the optimal workflow for your metadata is what makes your partner group the happiest. It's not the fastest, it's not the one that outputs the most, it's not the one even that's necessarily the most streamlined, right? But if I'm responsible for cataloging or updating the cataloging on Chickasaw materials, then maybe my optimal workflow should be what leaves me with the best relationship with my local Chickasaw community. And by redefining those terms in terms of interpersonal relationships, you're at least able to, I think of it as, use information technology vocabulary to create better personal systems. Because when we were all talking about defining it, we talked about output, security, data packets, right? We defined it in terms of technology and output, but not people. Okay. Oh my God, that was a lot of talking. I know there's always a lot of me talking at first, but I always feel like we learned all these great things, let's share. So we could now do a couple of different things. We can either let people get coffee and snacks if you want, briefly, and we can also either look at this toolkit that we have and let you explore that a bit, or talk, sort of have a discussion about how you see this showing up in library archives education. It's like a choose your own.
I was kind of hoping that we could like look at the toolkit at some point, but I was also hoping for the latter.
So we can split, there's still a lot of time, yeah, we definitely have time to do that. So do we want to say like, maybe we'll take 5 minutes and just let you stretch a little and get some snacks, and I just always feel like after I've been boring people, boring to tears for, yeah. And then in 5 minutes we can actually look at the toolkit. So if you have a laptop, this is the time to open it up and get it on the network also. Write down your questions. I didn't want to cut us off. I don't think anyone had any other questions. Take a little breather. So I'm going to turn it over to Mattie, who will show you the website, and please do feel free to follow along. It's at that des4div.library.northeastern.edu.
Yeah. So welcome to the toolkit. We kind of, the way this thing has evolved is pretty interesting. Originally we didn't kind of think of it the way we do now as more of like an extension of a publication. I guess originally we kind of just thought about it as like, here's this thing, but now it's kind of taken on a different personality. So this is the welcome page when you first get to the website. This is what you're going to find. It just kind of orients you to the toolkit. And so it's got a little bit of information there. It's composed of our case studies, study paths, and then like a curated list of resources, which we call readings and videos. So to kind of start out, you've got the user guides that are going to show the formats, which kind of just outline what are the study paths, what are the resources, and then so it talks about those, kind of how we came about concluding like what study paths are to us and how we think those fit into the curriculum for both classes and professional development and workplaces. So really and truly the goal of this whole project in general is just to kind of educate ourselves and then be able to say like, okay, so here's what other places are doing and here's what we want to do, but have like concrete evidence of when trying to advocate for yourself and your users and the systems that you want. And so on the resources end, with regards to this website, you've got the case studies, which I'll show in a few minutes, readings and videos, communities of practice, and then model projects. Everyone following? If I'm going too slow, like just yell at me. So next up is orientations. These are just kind of orientations in the broadest sense, ways to kind of get you involved with the toolkit and kind of understand the way in which we're coming at this issue. From the get-go, we came at it from a feminist perspective, understanding that user systems are not non-biased. They are in fact biased. Like we knew what we were going to find. We knew it existed. So there are 2 orientations written. One called Empowering Pedagogy, which is just a phenomenal orientation, and then another one called Organizational Change, written by our own Amanda. And so I would definitely recommend taking some time to read those, should you so desire. Moving on to the next thing of the website is the study paths. So the way these are available to you is they're tagged as the study path right here. Then you've got the title of them followed by the author, as well as how we think they fall into the categories that we've specified. So documenting systems, for example, is going to address technical design and user experience. So those are all tags that you can narrow down over here. So if you just wanted to see algorithmic bias, you could click that box and that would be the only thing showing up. And then we've also got a curated little sentence to 2 sentences talking about what that resource actually is. Another way to narrow it down is this communities of focus, and that is pretty self-explanatory. If you want something that's dealing with Indigenous people, you can click that box. It's not populated at the bottom, it's just something that we in the back end tag resources as. And again, the format's down on the bottom. So just clicking on one, you can see it's got, again, the little short summary, and then this, we kind of standardized how they're presented. So you've got the learning objectives at the top, the activity, kind of what the goal of the said activity is, questions you should ask, and then the readings and resources that you would need to do the activity. Making sense? Everyone following? Questions, comments, concerns? Stop me. And then next is the case studies. Again, both the study paths and the case studies were created specifically for this project. They're not anywhere else. And so that is just a really, really, really awesome thing about the project. So again, case studies are formatted much the same as the study paths, with the title followed by the author, the tags, a short summary, and then when you click on it, it's the article itself. Moving forward, again, you can do topics over here, and so by clicking that, that'll show like algorithmic bias, both case studies, study paths, and resources like readings and videos and communities of practice, et cetera, et cetera. To get to like the curated list, so we were talking about the 400 plus Zotero bibliography that we had earlier. These are the readings and videos and communities of practices and model projects are from that Zotero bibliography, but they're ones that we've curated specifically for this website because we think they're particularly insightful in different areas of the project, and think they can be just potentially fruitful for anyone trying to learn about different things. They're also formatted much the same with the title followed by the author and then a short summary. We have typically included the abstract and then the link to how you can get to the article itself. Unfortunately, as is the case with most academic journal, a lot of these are paywalled. But being your association with university, most all of them can be found. If there was an unpaywalled version, we linked it to that one, just to try and figure that out. Again, you've got the search option up here. Let's see, communities of practice and model projects are again much the same with the tags and just understanding. I feel like yeah, I've talked enough. If you want to click around.
Yeah, so I think there's actually a couple of specific, so then we'll take the next maybe 15 minutes and ask you to do a couple of specific things, just to sort of guide, instead of like, click around. I want information. So what I would love, if you could do, is take a look at the study paths and case studies in particular, and see if there are any that are applicable to either your work that you've already done, or something that you think would fit into one of your classes, or that you would like to fit into one of your classes. Basically, my question for you is look through the study paths and case studies and see if they are useful, right? And I don't mean useful in the sense of it's something that you could concretely see using in a class or at your work. And by using, I mean, you know, not like you have to lead a revolution or anything, but just where you might pass it on to someone to read. So does that make sense as an initial task? So just take a look through, tell us what's useful, something that you would use either in a class, that you would like to use either in a class, or share with people you work with. Feel free to talk with each other. And maybe we'll take 10 minutes. Maybe I'll make that kind of short so we make sure we have lots of time to talk about it. Make sense? And also, I wish you had something on X and you don't is a totally legitimate piece of feedback, right? Okay. So I'm gonna like walk around and hover and eat, and so just, yeah, feel comfortable. Was there, I think we'll start with those 2 questions for folks.
sounds good.
Alright, good. I'm gonna get one of those brownies. I heard brownies are really good. So we'll cut you off. So we started pretty narrowly, right? Asking you to just look at the study paths and case studies. So were there any that seemed particularly applicable to something that you've either done at work or in class or you want to? So over here, yeah.
So community inquiry self-reflection. In undergrad, I actually, my university partnered up with the National Historic Park Services, and the point was to have students go out and see what their outreach programs were like. So how the park had reached out to other members of the community, and then how they represented them within the park. So I had chose Valley Forge. So I wanted to look at like, there's all these statues about every like person from the oh, come on.
Sorry, it's best just give it.
Yeah, okay, from American.
Yeah.
But for example, there's only one statue in the park that represents African American soldiers that were at Valley Forge, and what's written on it is actually on the opposite side of the statue, which is, so the statue, there's a path, a walkway path, and the statue is next to it, but what's written dedicated to the people in the regiment is on the back of the statue. So as there's only one statue, yes, it shows representation, but it's also poorly conducted. And then I was also looking at like the museum that they have at the park, and like what they have about the Native Americans at the time, and also what they have about African Americans. And even though it's one of the like well-known National Historic Park Services, their representation could have been much better. So I had to like kind of like point out what they could have done and how they could change that. But then that leads me to like the study path of history affects relationships, because now if representation is done poorly, you're building up mistrust of other communities.
And did the community inquiries seem then sort of very relevant to what you had already done in the past?
Yeah.
Yes. And then that, okay. Alright, great, community inquiry, and then I think there's a hand maybe over here, like anything that seemed particularly
The study path for the audiovisual ontologies. So for one of my classes, we had to do a final presentation on for 415, which is information organization, and we're doing a topic that's based around metadata representing archival and cultural heritage artifacts, so like works of art, architectural works. So this is a really great study path because one of the 4 kind of standards or frameworks we have to focus on is called CDOC, CRM. So it's, the acronym's actually in Spanish, and it means,
it's an international
Yep.
cultural heritage description standard, yeah.
Yep, so it provides definitions and formal structure for describing the implicit and explicit concepts used in this kind of documentation. So I think it'd be really great to really talk about as far as what do you say to lead up to explaining how great this is. So I do want to bring this up to my team members.
Thank you. That's great. And it's so funny that you mentioned CDOC CRM, because that was one of our original, when we were having like grandiose ideas. We're like, we're gonna get someone who's involved in that standard, and they're gonna write a case study, and we're gonna talk about this in the future. But yeah, that's a really important standard generally. All right, anything else that seemed relevant to something that you've done, or that might fit into?
I was looking at the case study of digitizing and enhancing description across collections to make African American materials more discoverable on Uber.
Yeah.
Search African American history by Dorothy Berry.
Yeah.
Honestly, I was just kind of browsing for whatever caught my eye, but this actually does relate to stuff that I've done. Basically, the point of this, from what I've read, was like twofold. Was one, making more documents accessible, so to increase the field in terms of African American history, and also making the actual like searches better. I've done digitization, so that's kind of where my interest came in, and also I'm really interested in like collection management in general. So I thought this was really interesting. Also, the project sets out to digitize an estimated 500,000 files, which that's so much files.
That's terrifying.
Yeah.
Yep, a huge amount of management.
Yeah, I did that for like 3 or 4 months, and we did like not even way less than that. Like, yeah. But yeah, so it was a really interesting document that I think it brings up a lot of different, I mean, it's tagged as metadata and nomenclature and technical design, but I also think it kind of like touches on a lot of different aspects, which made it really interesting. Yeah.
Thank you. The tagging was interesting, as anyone in here would know, right? We're tempted just to like catalog it with everything. And be like, no.
Oh yeah, no, I think that you picked 2 good ones. But
so thinking about then, so those are some of the things that stood out. So I'd love to hear from folks any sort of general comments that you have, and these can be negative. This can be sort of like, I wish it had, or I wonder why you did this thing. And then I think that will be sort of a good springboard into, and then how does something like this toolkit, or at least these issues, apply to LAS education? So any larger comments on the toolkit itself? Stuff that you wish it had, or stuff that confused you in its usage?
I didn't look at everything. Would this have any ties to the cataloging cultural objects toolkit?
In the sense, that is a good question. So in the sense of, is that something we would point people to, right? And we made the decision, and tell me if this is a reasonable decision, to not include resources that were sort of standards in the field, because we kind of figured those are available elsewhere, like information about those are available elsewhere. We wanted this to be a very sort of focused on diversity, inclusion, technology, technical systems. So, for example, there's a lot of work that our profession needs to do in terms of diversity in hiring, right? But we were like, nope, there are other people working on that, there are other people that are doing a lot of great work. So my sense was no, right? Like that came up, and there were a couple of other, I can't remember now, but some other broad standards where we were like, should we note those somewhere here? And we decided no, because they weren't focused enough on this particular issue. You are all free to tell me that that is the wrong decision. Or, not saying we'll change it, but like, I'm totally, yeah.
I don't think it's the wrong decision.
Any other things that seem broken, confusing, not useful? This is like the constructive criticism portion of
I
the
don't
evening
know if
here.
it's a bad thing, but it seems like a lot of the stuff on the tabs overlap a lot. So it kind of brings you to sometimes the same, not the same information, but like it shows you a lot of the stuff that you've seen if you were looking like through a different direction, which I think is both helpful and could also be misleading, but I think it's mostly helpful.
Yeah, I'm seeing that kind of as like a confusion of access points. Sort of, we want you to be able to find it through this path, and then through this path, and then through this path.
I think maybe because I spend too much time online shopping, but I'd probably like start with one tab and then exhaust it and then move to another, and then only to find that it has very similar things as the first one. But I think that's also like me only using it for like 10 minutes and not like knowing it super well.
I guess on the note, like a small thing for the API study path, it references the Mercado case study, and I was like, I like found it eventually, but if there was like a link to that.
Oh, it wasn't linked? Yeah, that's just
I don't, yeah.
We're still cleaning up, so.
Yeah.
So Any other? So what is this, so this is our next sort of question. So one of our goals for this project was thinking, where do we have impact? Right, we don't want to just say, this is a problem. We wanted to figure out where to actually have impact. So we identified workplace, vendor systems, commercial systems, and LIS education. So how do we have impact in LIS education? And I know that some of you are just starting out, and I have my own very strong opinions about this, but I will. Right, like where are there points of impact for you now as someone learning?
I mean, not to throw shade, but I feel like when you're in school, you read a lot more about things than like you might as a practice. Oh, some people might read more than they are when they're practicing.
Yeah.
Part of it is someone is standing there and telling you to read things. But I mean, I feel like this is intended to be educational at the very least, whether or not you do it formally in education.
This is like something I've been thinking a lot about since we started planning this event, especially like with the way that like the idea of like diversity can sometimes be problematic as opposed to other ways of looking at things like inclusion and justice, so that sometimes diversity can end up being like, let's sort of tack this on to like show how you would explore this topic for marginalized communities or whatever. So like in a syllabus or whatever, it kind of could end up getting just tacked on at the end or something like that, where it's sort of seen as a marginal issue itself instead of like sort of the potential for design for diversity in terms of designing inclusive information systems, I think has to be at the forefront of every practitioner's mind, no matter what you're working on. And so it's sort of about like decentering like our understanding, like is the way I like to look at it. So I think like it would be better if we had more courses and such where you started with, reading Doris Margaret Clark or something like that in terms of cataloging. You started with exploring things a little bit more from the margins and seeing how that can critique like hegemonic structures. I'm thinking specifically about cataloging, description.
But I like that you brought in Clark, right? Because, you can look at this as part of this is the history of information science, right? So why not, if in the start of a core class you talk about the history of information science, this is a strand. And it's maybe something that's coming out more strongly now, but it's not a new strand. So I think that's one potential placement, right? If you're talking about the history of this profession. So in your classes, when do you talk about systems design? If you do.
There's the class 4, kind of, like 46, I think, is like systems design analysis. So there's that, of course.
And who takes that course?
Like more technical people who are
Like I'm going to take the next semester.
Yeah.
So it's an elective.
Yes.
Right. And does it have prerequisites or, like what I'm kind of getting at too is sort of, if these concepts are, which I would argue they shouldn't be, but if they're siloed off in a course and then that course has multiple prerequisites and then it's also not an elective.
Right.
Like I know you've talked about how the dual major is it's very set out, right? Like you have a pretty firm schedule. So do you have options, like in the dual archives major, do you have, if you wanted to take technical classes, what are your options?
You can take electives. I know in the first year there's like nothing we can do. And then the second year we have 1 or 2 a semester. And then the third year we have 2 a semester. So there's some room.
It doesn't matter if you want to go out of your way to take our technical class. And then if you don't, you're just basically putting a blind eye to it.
They're not exactly marketed
Yeah.
to archives.
Yes.
That's interesting too.
Also,
But then,
since
it also starts to create divisions within the field because
Yeah.
if you don't want to learn about it, then you don't understand it and appreciate it. Whereas like 415 is learning about metadata. So even if you don't do it, you are told to appreciate the person who does. But you have to be exposed to that.
And I think it's also learning how to talk to the person. Okay, so, realistically, except for maybe one or two of us, but like, no one in this room is gonna go be a programmer, right? I mean, you might, right? That's why I was like, I think I remember what you were saying. But in your cohort,
Yeah.
there are maybe 2 or 3 people that are actually gonna go be programmers. Like, my position is a technical position. Like, I'm an assistant director in a technical group. I am not a programmer. I am the person that helps manage, the work that programmers are doing. So you have to know how to talk to your programmers
Right.
and be able to articulate, this is important because, and here's why, yes, it's actually gonna make your life harder, right? Like, more complex systems are more complex. It sucks for your programmers. But you have to be able to sort of articulate why. So where else, what other kinds of classes, have you talked about things like algorithmic bias or bias in cataloging, and where has that appeared?
We literally talked about this today in our web development class. So, but it was more in the context of designing websites. So it kind of does align with web accessibility in that web accessibility means to design a website that disabled people can also use. That doesn't just mean physical disabilities, like visual disabilities or, maybe memory-based things. So you want to, you have the same kind of principles of inclusion where you don't want to make it seem like they're just like an extra thing you have to worry about, which you can tell. So it means being able to access everything like through the keyboard as you can't move a mouse. It means making sure you have a color palette that's appropriate for people, maybe you're colorblind or partially blind, to be able to see everything. It means having features maybe that convert speech to text or have audio recordings for certain things. You miss your people who can't read, so this is kind of this is kind of a leeway into talking about diversity or inclusion in sites.
So, any other classes where this has come up? Inclusive metadata, or problems with LCSH, or finding aids?
we have to do that for our discussions.
Yeah.
Yeah, our
Important
discussion this
things.
week was about
Yeah.
terminology focused around Native Americans and how there has been different terms used throughout the years. And our discussion was like, should we go back and fix?
Subject headings?
Yeah, subject
headings.
headings. So it was, should LC go back and fix these subject headings? Like, yes or why not? Funding, all of that type of
Yeah.
stuff.
And how they're disproportionately more topics about like
Massacres,
things to do with violence
Yes.
or like
discovery.
discovery or like like
An
first contact
exploration.
or talking about Native Americans in a historical sense instead of a contemporary sense.
Is this a dating thing?
Yeah.
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 I think that may even be better than what I had 2 years ago.
Yeah, that's good.
We didn't have like a huge lecture on it. It's more
Yeah,
like
right.
let's think about this.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. It's kind
And
of,
then
like,
415 and 407 always talk about how biased Google is, just because of algorithms that
Right.
are there.
Yeah. Library science degree. How much does Google mess people up?
A while ago too, like I worked on this digital archive where we took the true story of Island of Blue Dolphins, which is the story of an actual woman being trapped on the island. So this is a lone woman in last Indian's digital archive, and my work was to focus. Oh, I was supposed to focus on data visualizations, which were meant to kind of explore hidden trends within all the different documents that were written about the story, like from 1847 when she was found up until the present day. And a lot of these visualizations were all like collecting the different tropes or these kind of stereotypes that were used over these hundreds of years. So these included like noble savage and lost Indian and small child. It was it was starting like how a lot of these just stayed too up until like the 80s, which is really scary. I think about like Noble Savage, like that's like 1920s kind of at the latest.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I mean, I think that relates a lot to what David was talking about in some ways where, so I took information organization, and I think it was still then called cataloging, in 2001. I was lucky enough to take it with Candy Schwartz. I don't know if anyone has had Candy, or she's like, Candy. She's amazing. And so I think because her approach was looking at it as an intellectual activity, it sort of automatically led you to those kinds of discussions, right? But thinking about it as related to what David said, I think that idea of, you know, what is the long history of description and information science, right? And here we're like, what is the long history of Noble Savage? Like that is a long history, yeah. So it might be that sort of like kind of historical contextualization is a place to.
And there's also, I think, I've noticed a lot of stuff in which things are added on to, but it doesn't necessarily get rid of the old stuff.
Yes.
It kind of just hides it between new words and stuff.
I would love to have a case study on that. So I thought, I'm realizing now there's a class.
Yeah, there's a bunch of people.
I thought, yeah, we were here till 4, so I just don't want to.
I just checked, we technically are
You are.
here
Okay,
until
sorry.
4, it's a
But I'll just
0-second cutoff.
So one of the interesting pieces that we found in our research too is that a lot of people are able to make those changes when they have a system degree. Right? So they can't get the funding and resources to do it whenever. But if you're moving library catalogs, right, then you're like, well, now we're going to all do our data cleanup. And then that's the point of impact where you could go back and redo that.
Yeah.
Which like totally, this is what I learned from systems librarians and like repository managers was like, oh right, migration.
Yeah.
So if you have this sort of list of things where you're like, oh god, this needs to be fixed and this needs to be fixed, then migration is first.
Yeah, I'll just say one more thing. My undergrad did a recent reading of the collection, and what happened was the head of the archive decided to take some of the books that were related to like Native Americans or African Americans, and they included it in the archive to be like, hey, this was horrible and this was stereotyped, but this was also how literature was once written about these groups of people, and how can we use it to study for like future historians or like academic research.
So that's another reason I've heard to not do data overlays, or to, rather than overlay, keep all the terms, to preserve that history of, you know what, actually,
People used to say
people
this.
used to say this, and this term was used for, so.
But it's also like you're creating a primary document instead of tagging, you know, like, then that becomes the document
Part of the
itself.
historiography of the topic too.
Right.
True.
Which that ruins the field of history.
But if that term could actually be hurtful to someone that runs into it,
Yes.
then do you, so then what I've heard some people talk about is, do you keep it but suppress it from public view?
But then is
But
that moral?
keep it in the back end so that you can do that sort of research?
Do we want to send them the link to the
Oh, yeah,
survey?
the link in the survey, thank you. I was a little bit panicked on, oh yeah, so if you want to look at the toolkit more, that would be awesome. And there's a link, there's a little box that says send comments. And that has a link to a feedback survey.
Thank you.
I can send that to you. Thank you everyone for coming.